Listen up, folks. We are just a few weeks away from Oklahoma football. Week 1 coming up September 4th. And following each game, we will have post-game right here at the Voice of College Football, Oklahoma. So we will be giving you details as it rolls out in regards to when that post-game is going to be provided each week. But typically, it's going to be right after the game, featuring Jason. We're also looking for some support for Jason, some backups, and for some people for him to collaborate with. But Jason will be anchoring our post-game coverage here at the Voice of College Football OU. So be looking forward to that, and I'll be blasting out plenty of reminders for that. So all of you can lock in with your comments, your questions. You can vent. If Oklahoma only wins by 52 points the first week, the world is crashing down around us. Or whatever the case might be, if they actually get challenged against somebody like a Nebraska in week 3, I doubt it, but it's possible. They've got guys on scholarship too. So there are going to be those games when the Sooners, with these incredible expectations, don't necessarily lose, but will not meet those expectations. It's just the matter of competition. The other guys have big talented guys too, who lift weights and watch film and try just as hard. So I think sometimes we hold these teams to such high standards because of the name and the colors that they wear, that they have to be perfect, that every game has to be a 5-touchdown win. And again, yes, the recruiting rankings will tell us, and the record from year to year will tell us that they are overwhelmingly the better team almost every time they step on the field. But the other programs know what they're doing too. They're well coached and have athletes, so they're trying to.
Oh,
and it means just as much to them.
Well, and I think when in that line of thinking, Mark, I'm with you. Absolutely agree. And I think the nature of Oklahoma fans, and it's not any different than any big blood, especially or blue blood, I should say, any specifically in the top 5 teams this year. But I think there's an expectation out there that whoever it is, specifically Oklahoma in this case, they go out and they dominate every single opponent, specifically based on what the schedule looks like. Is this on the outside looking in, it looks like maybe a little bit easier this year. And so when you kind of look at that, I think one of the big things in the off season, I think from a mentality perspective, we talked about Oklahoma losing to Kansas State the last 2 years. In that vein, you go to the SEC, you got to bring it every single week. There's not going to be any. There's no Kansas States out there really when you think about that. So, I think the mentality that Oklahoma brings, and it comes from the top down, from Lincoln Riley on down, having that killer instinct, I think is a big question mark into the season for me. If you look at that, they've allowed teams to stay around from time to time. You go to even the Kansas State this past year they were up 35-14, all the way to the Big 12 championship game. They had their foot on the neck of Iowa State and could have put them away, pretty easily early in that game, but they kind of took their foot off the gas. And and I think it's partly Lincoln Riley, and I think it's partly just the offense, and really him understanding how to play offense with a defense which is as talented as what they have. So I think that's another big storyline that we'll be following throughout the season on what does that look like.
So Jason, I got to say, you made a big comment there about there not being any Kansas States in the SEC.
Well, there's
one. Of course, Kansas State's all over the place, of course, to a certain extent. But when I think Kansas State, I'm thinking 7-5, 8-4. Of course, Bill Snyder did much better than that for a long period of time, but that's been a while. They're settling into that 7-5 kind of program, and even under Snyder the second time. So you don't think that Kansas State would be along the lines of what Tennessee's been recently, or Missouri, somebody like that, South Carolina?
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. And I think maybe, to your point, Mark, I should have
I understand your point. Yeah.
No, I think I probably should have phrased just a little bit differently in saying that if you if you don't bring that A game every single week, there's a team like Kansas State, and maybe there's not a team that you immediately think from a Big 12 perspective that that equates. But I mean that point's well taken. But I think the overall point is that to make sure, which is a big part of what Oklahoma has been, they get up for the big games. If it's the Texas, the Iowa States, the the Oklahoma States of the world. Now it's where maybe their attention's a little bit diverted and they're not completely up for a team like Kansas State, in which that will come back to bite them. And I think you almost look at when you look at predictions. We talked about that a little bit earlier. There's going to be a game this year where Oklahoma's not completely in it for whatever reason. The motivation is not as strong as it would be for some of the other games. And does Oklahoma have the ability, have the will? Does they have that championship medal to be able to get over, that and win those games where they're not at their best?
Absolutely. And I didn't want to nitpick there, but I just wanted to get your next level of thinking there on that statement. And I think more so to the last point you made, if you really look at the Big 12 recently, with Texas being down for now more than 10 years, except for possibly one season, and Iowa State elevating itself as clearly the second best team. I don't know about the second best program. I'm more of a program guy. I've got to see it for 3 or 4 years, and Matt Campbell's done an amazing job. But up until last year, it was 7-5, 8-4.
Yeah.
It wasn't anything crazy. I don't even think they finished in the top 25. Maybe they did one time, but they had some 7-5s there that didn't land them after like a bowl win, 8-5, or a bowl loss. I think they went 7-6 the year before. So anyway, my point being that next tier under Oklahoma the last 5 years or so in the conference has been razor thin. It's been like somebody's jumped up temporarily. Iowa State the last couple of years, or really the last year, season played. Texas in 2018 when they won the Sugar Bowl. TCU briefly. Going back to when Baylor and TCU were both good, 2014, obviously both came within a whisker of the playoffs, where since then, that layer under Oklahoma is very thin before you get into like a lot of 6-6, 7-5 teams that you can kind of group all together. Where in the SEC, if Alabama's having a year where they're quote unquote dominating, you still have, you've got a nice, thick layer of like 5-6 teams that are legitimate top 25 teams. And if they're not finishing in the top 25, it's pretty much because they lost to a bunch of really good teams, and they're actually one of the 25 best teams in the country. I think we could go to the SEC every year and point out teams that they just had a brutal schedule. Would we feel confident placing them in the top 25 if we just said, here are the top 25 best teams in the country, and they're going to go out and play the other 24 teams? I think, on a year, let's say Auburn goes 8-5 and doesn't finish in the top 25, most observers would think that they're still one of the 25 best teams in the country.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that's why I kind of made the point of mentality, because I think Oklahoma's gotten away with that, with that mentality over the years, exactly to your point, Mark, because the talent disparity has been so great. Even you've got Iowa State, you've got Texas, you've got, Oklahoma State to a certain degree, but you've had these teams where Oklahoma has overwhelming talent advantage, so they've not necessarily had to bring their A game. There's not a game this year. I wouldn't say during the regular season where Oklahoma is going to be at a talent disadvantage on the field until they get to the playoffs. But when you look at the SEC schedule, whether it's next year or whenever that might be, there's probably going to be 2 or 3, I would say anywhere from probably 2 to 4 games each year where Oklahoma could be at a talent disadvantage based on how the schedule, works out. So I think that mentality, which is something that they need to start building towards this year, will help them in the coming years.
Yes, I cycle back through my thought. To be more specific, there basically has been one team in the Big 12 that kind of jumps up for that 1 year, gives Oklahoma a bit of a push. Like last year, obviously, it was Iowa State. They beat them in the regular season. They challenged them in the Big 12 championship game. Oklahoma still wins. Iowa State finishes 9-3, wins the Fiesta Bowl. Year before, 2019, guess that would have been Baylor. Baylor had a really good season, only had one loss. Had a big lead on Oklahoma. That was the year that they had the enormous lead, and Oklahoma came back. Yeah, Jalen Hurts at quarterback, came back and beat them. Baylor pushed them in the Big 12 championship game, but then Baylor drops back. 1 year it was Will Greer in West Virginia. Took him to that crazy, what was that, like 61-58 final that would have forced, was that before the Big 12 championship?
It was.
Game came back? Yeah, so that must have been 2016.
It was, yeah.
Because then TCU made it to the Big 12 championship game in 17 and really didn't challenge Oklahoma in either the regular season game or the Big 12 championship game, but they were the team that jumped up at number 2. Texas took their turn in 2018, and in some respects seemed to be the most capable of. It was a really good Big 12 championship game. Oklahoma just kind of took it over in the last 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And of course, Texas won the regular season matchup and won the Sugar Bowl. So it's you're looking at 5 or 6 consecutive years where it's been a team just kind of jump up momentarily and challenge Oklahoma to two different extents. So for all of you that think Iowa State's going to be around forever, this might be their last go around, especially if they can't hang on to their coach.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, Mark, those are ebbs and flows of some of these programs that are. I mean, you talked about Baylor. Baylor's has been really good, but they've kind of fallen off over the last couple of years. So, and then you look at TCU. They've been a team that has been, they made it to that Big 12 championship game, but they've been kind of, a little bit towards the middle of the pack over the last couple of years. And then, Oklahoma State's another team that's interesting. But I think when you look at the schedule for this season, this Oklahoma team, it's beneficial. I think the way that it works out. You've got Iowa State at home, you have TCU at home, you have West Virginia at home. So I think, in terms of the question here, who's going to give Oklahoma a challenge? I mean, Texas and Oklahoma State are the two games that are still going to be tough, especially this year with a little bit of the animosity that's going on behind the scenes between Oklahoma and Oklahoma State over the SEC thing. And I mean, I think by that time, it's the final game of the year. Let's see, November 27th. So I think by Thanksgiving, we'll have an idea of when Oklahoma and Texas are playing in the SEC, especially if it's 2022. So that one, could bring even a little bit more meaning there. But I think if I had to circle one game on the schedule that could be, outside looking in terms of a team that you don't necessarily think that would challenge Oklahoma, specifically being at home, I think I look at the TCU game. They play TCU right after Texas. So Oklahoma they go to Kansas State on October 2nd, which, you would think that they have a lot of motivation going into that game. And then obviously Texas on the 9th, and then they go back and go home to play TCU on the 16th. You could see, where that could be a little bit of a letdown, situation for Oklahoma, specifically if they're able to win that game against Texas. So that's a game that, you kind of look at. Maybe West Virginia at home, at Baylor late in the year is another one. So it's hard to your point, Mark, it's so hard because it's been somebody different almost every year. So it's so hard to pinpoint that. But I think TCU's a team that I think is a little bit better than people, and we'll get into this. I'm sure we'll do some Big 12 predictions or national predictions here as we get closer to the season. But the TCU is a team that's, I think, is a little bit better than that a lot of people give them credit for.
Yeah, without getting into details about TCU, just in watching Big 12 Media Days and doing a little bit of research during the offseason, Gary Patterson and others, offensive coordinator, have stated Max Duggan's improved considerably. I know that that's a typical statement to make about any player or a starting player quarterback during the offseason, but they seem to be authentic about that. And of course, he's had health issues, so it's good to see him back and ready to play. And TCU's defensive, just in regards to, as we rolled out the best defensive linemen and you had prepared the best linebackers in the conference, TCU stacks up with I don't want to say waves and waves of guys, but for a defensive front, they seem to have a number of guys who have already made plays or freakish kind of athletes. I think that they may return to their defensive form this year. And the other thing about the schedule, Jason, and I have no numbers to back this up, but I went through Athlons and maybe another magazine, and I've got my certain criticisms of these magazines for as good as they are, and they're exceptional. One would be, I'm going to take us down a different path real quick. One would be is they basically take last season's results, tweak them slightly, and roll them out as this year's results. So what I did was I looked at 3 consecutive off-season, preseason magazines between like Athlon, Street and Smith's, somebody else, maybe Lindy's. And I looked to see, now you can't, unfortunately, we can't really do it this year because of the COVID season and the inordinate amount of games that were played by everybody. Nobody played a 12-game schedule, so you can't match up, 9-3 versus 8-4. And so it kind of messes up my research here for this particular season. But the 3 previous seasons going into 19, 18, and 17, I looked at those preseason magazines to determine who are they pointing out that's going to upgrade considerably or downgrade considerably. And I held that as a 3-game measurement, meaning, and I just arbitrarily chose that. Somebody could choose something else, but I thought that was significant and reasonable, that if a team's 6-6 and they go 9-3 the next year, that's a significant improvement. Yep. Or if a 6-6 team goes 3-9 the next year, that's a significant. So I counted how many instances that those magazines were predicting that to happen for somebody in the Power 5, and it was typically like 3 or 4 teams out of 65. Okay. Then I went went through the standings to see how many times that actually happened. And I was surprised because I think of college football just being the same every year. Well, the top's the same, but the rest of it changes considerably. Between 18 and 23 teams, those 3 consecutive seasons either increased or decreased by 3 games in the standings. So that's like a quarter to a third of the Power 5 significantly changing from year to year.
Yeah, no, that is interesting to hear. I certainly I agree with you. I would have certainly expected the top ones to be the top, but I think it's interesting to see that those other teams that you mentioned, the ebb and flow within each and every year. I think it makes both of our points brilliantly here, that we that for Oklahoma on the schedule there seems to be someone else that's going to jump up and be there. Like, for instance, I think Baylor is a team in the Big 12 this year that would probably meet that criteria that you had mentioned. I think they at least they get to 5 wins this year, maybe one more to get to a bowl game. So you mentioned Kansas State. They're perennially a 7-5, 8-4 type season, type team. But they were 5-7 last year. Do they go up a little bit? And yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting to look at for sure.
And the other part in that I was going to bring up, as I looked at the schedule, and I thought it was interesting that you brought up a trap game for Oklahoma being against TCU at home. because another thing that I checked out in these magazines, and this is conventional thought, this is what most people do when they're looking for upsets, they go to road games.
Mm-hmm.
They typically go to road games, and that's conventional thought, and the winning percentage is higher at home for teams, but I think we overplay that. I think that there are a number of upsets that happen at home for these teams. Again, more likely to happen on the road, but I don't think it's just overwhelmingly always happens on the road. And that's another thing I've determined in looking at these magazines and looking at various prognostications online, that they're always pinpointing the losses to be on the road.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think two of Oklahoma's biggest losses over the last few years, came at home. Certainly last year against Kansas State, and a few years ago against Iowa State, when they weren't quite what they are now. So, and even in some of these other teams, years ago, Alabama lost to Texas A&M under, of course, that's years and years ago, but they lost that game at home. They lost to LSU at home. Not a huge upset, obviously, but when you look at some of these top teams,
they lost to Ole Miss at home.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's right. And then Clemson, years and years ago, lost to Pittsburgh, at home, and then almost last year, almost lost to Boston College at home. So yeah, I think some of these teams, when you look at it, you kind of go under the assumption that they let their guard down a little bit more when they're at home, and maybe think the crowd can will them to a win more so than on the road. So yeah, that definitely happens more than you would think.
All right, folks, it's been great to have everyone here for another edition of Oklahoma Sooners Live right here at the Voice of College Football. And again, this only happens because of this guy, Jason Ray. Catch him at Last Word on College Football as they prepare you for the season. And another reminder that we will provide Oklahoma post-game right here throughout the season.